Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexei the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. Today, we're pleased to have on David Klion, who's a sort of freelance writer, scholar, analyst of, I would say, lefty foreign policy, particularly, and general Twitter nemesis of Hillary Clinton and Neera Tanden.
And don't leave out news editor of Jewish Currents. I do have half a job.
Yes, I was just getting that, but
yes.
To get us started, can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I'm sort of curious, like what's the story? Like, I've seen a lot of people I know associated with Jewish Currents, but I know like almost nothing else about it aside from that.
So Jewish Currents is we actually just got a nice little publicity boost a week or two ago in the New York Times. Michelle Goldberg mentioned us a few times as part of a general revival of the Jewish left in her very good column. So some New York Times columnists are even good. They do exist. But Jewish Currents has actually been around since 1946 and has been in continuous print publication since then.
Really?
Yes, but in its current incarnation, it's only I think less than 2 years old. Basically, the longtime editor turned it over to my friend Jacob Plitman and what's now an all-millennial editorial staff, plus a bunch of millennials in media and politics circles who are now sitting on the board along with the old board. So basically, it's gotten this new injection of funding and a new staff, and it is, if I may say so, very vital right now. And I should say I only came on early this year, so I wasn't on the staff for the initial relaunch, although I did write a few pieces for them last year. But basically, we see ourselves in the current Jewish media environment as the practically the only unapologetically left-wing Jewish publication. If you compare us to The Forward, which has been around for, I think, over a century, but recently ceased its print publication, and its website, as we've covered on Jewish Currents, is prone toward really outrageous both sidesism. Like, they'll publish good left-wing opinions, and then the next day they'll publish incredibly reactionary, sometimes racist stuff. And their opinion editor, Batya Ungar-Sargon, who is outspoken on Twitter, she thinks she's serving the best interests of the Jewish community and the left by doing this. We disagree.
Is it like she's like the Joe Rogan of Jewish publications?
I would never have thought to draw that analogy, but they do have a kind of intellectual dark web sensibility now that you mention it, and you could draw connections between Batya's approach to politics and Barry Weiss's, although I think what Barry does is more insidiously clever and certainly more influential. But and then there's Tablet, which is a Jewish publication that I think has drifted steadily rightward over the decade or so of its existence. And then there's other publications. I mean, one I think very honorable exception is 972 Mag in Israel, which is basically the closest thing there is to the magazine of the Israeli left. And Haaretz obviously also publishes a lot of good stuff. But I think that we, both in our unapologetically critical approach toward Israel, without any equivocation, and then also our kind of radical Yiddish cultural roots, and our sort of roots in the labor movement and in all progressive and left-wing struggles, really set us apart. And we've been able to bring together a community, including with roughly quarterly parties here in Brooklyn, where I live, of young, brilliant, very active, very plugged in left-wing Jews. And, it's not religious. It's not specifically anti-religious, but I would say the overall environment is very secular. And, I spoke to a recently retired rabbi who came to one of our parties, and he said he didn't necessarily agree with everything that we say, although he agrees with a lot of it. But to see, a few hundred young Jews together in a bar enjoying themselves as Jews was such a wonderful thing for him that he's how can we possibly be bad? So I took that to heart.
So,
good work.
Will you be reviewing the Barry Weiss book on how to defeat anti-Semitism?
Personally, I will not be, but yes, we have a review in the works. I cannot say more right now because its status is not totally clear. It might not work out, or it might be one of the most exciting pieces we've ever published. So let's hold off and see. But sooner or later, yes, one way or another, we will be reviewing this book.
Stay tuned, folks.
But in the meantime, I commend people to read Jordan Weissman's review of it in Slate, which came out the other day. Jordan, who I know and is a really nice guy, is not quite as far left as I am or as I think you are, but I would say he's a very liberal Democrat who's left curious. But and as a result, he wrote a very measured and fair review that is absolutely devastating. And I don't want to say any more about it, but people should look it up.
We'll link to that for sure.
Yeah.
So maybe to sort of like a window into the last few the topics that you've been sort of drilling down on. You've had this series of articles in The Nation. You had a profile of Matt Duss, sort of like broader piece about, can lefty sort of anti-war people make inroads? And then you've got a piece on the Quincy Institute, which we'll get into. But I think a good road into that is the recent closure of ThinkProgress, which was announced on Friday. I think that they had, they had been trying to find a publisher for it, or they say they've been trying to find a publisher for it, because it loses money, quote unquote. Though, it's like a kind of an odd standard. It's like, does Cap lose money? Like, are they taking in, like, are they selling, like merch or whatever to cover Neera Tanden's salary? But at any rate, so they're shut down, fired a bunch of people. And, ThinkProgress, for all of its, flaws, it was a pipeline for lefty journalists and foreign policy scholars, Eli Clifton, Matt Duss, Fez Shakir, right, who's now the campaign manager for Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, lots of others. Ali Gharib.
Yeah. And so, like, I don't know, what's your sort of general impression on, like, what this sort of means for the stuff you've been writing about?
Well, I don't know that it means anything. Okay. Let me say, first of all, that I've been a fan of ThinkProgress for a long time. I was certainly a fan of them in what I think of as their heyday, which was roughly Obama's first term. 2009 or 2008 through 2012, roughly. But beyond that as well. Back in the days of Google Reader, I used to have ThinkProgress in my Google Reader, so I would see all these names go by. And I've watched a lot of their alums go on to great things. And I'm a fan of a lot of the people who are working there now. Certainly, or who were until this week. And I think one misunderstanding that people in the kind of maybe Bernie left might have had about ThinkProgress was it was seen, I think, as an organ of the Center for American Progress, the largest Democratic Party-aligned think tank, which is run by Neera Tanden, and was founded by John Podesta. And that's a bit simplistic, and although it will no longer be going forward, and it obscures what ThinkProgress was actually about. So Podesta, of course, has many flaws, which we don't need to get into, but from people I've talked to, he did have a kind of a vision, too. And Podesta and Neera Tanden were both Clinton administration people, so both of these institutions kind of come out of Clinton world in the early aughts. But Podesta was the founder of both, and he had a vision that the Center for American Progress would be the kind of Democratic Party answer to the Heritage Foundation, or AEI, the major conservative think tanks that developed in, the 70s or 80s and are still going strong today. And then that ThinkProgress would be a kind of answer to the emergence of right-wing media, which I think we can all agree is a very serious problem. And it would do real investigative journalism and, from an unabashedly left perspective. But Podesta understood what journalism meant, and he understood that this could only work if it had editorial independence. And so it was blessed with that, and it was affiliated with CAP and supported with money from CAP, which has a lot of money, which we can get into as well. But it was supposed to be independent, and they really did stick to that for the most part. They hired, certainly in that first term Obama era I'm talking about, a very diverse and independent-minded, and I would say genuinely left-leaning staff, headed by Faz Shakir, who is now running Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign. And I would say that staff was, very progressive across the board. I mean, I think anyone could speak well of ThinkProgress's coverage of the kind of LGBT revolution of those years. Compared to any media outlet. But I think one place where they particularly distinguish themselves is in covering the Middle East and Israel-Palestine and the war on terror and the sort of omnipresent threat of war with Iran. ThinkProgress really was dedicated and principled on those issues in ways that did not always conveniently serve the interests of the Obama administration, or even more so, I would say, the then inevitable Hillary Clinton presidential campaign. So the problem was that a few years into that version of ThinkProgress, Podesta stepped down as president of CAP, and his deputy, Neera Tanden, took over, and she's still in charge today. And Neera, by all accounts I've ever heard, Neera's primary motivation is raising money from corporate contributors and donors, and at least prior to 2016, I would say laying the ground for herself to be chief of staff or some similarly high position in a Hillary Clinton administration, which of course we all knew was going to happen. She repeatedly interfered with ThinkProgress's editorial independence. And the most famous incident of this, which was covered a lot online at the time and which I've written about in some of the articles you mentioned, was in 2012 when a group of operatives at the Neoconservative Foundation for Defense of Democracies and AIPAC and other affiliated groups, basically what you could call the Israel lobby, decided they'd had enough of ThinkProgress's critical coverage of the occupation and decided to go after it with, all the expected insinuations about maybe half a dozen ThinkProgress staffers being anti-Semites. And rather than stand up for ThinkProgress and their independence, Neera, according to multiple accounts, tried to get them to stop writing about those topics, which she had no real right to do and was also cowardly. Now, why did she do that? I would assume because, Hillary Clinton and CAP drew funds from, very pro-Israel Democrats and people like Haim Saban, and also under Neera's guidance from the United Arab Emirates, which is a reactionary regime that has become a kind of de facto ally of Israel, and she just didn't want the trouble. She wanted to be able to do things like like the event she did, kind of friendly interview with Benjamin Netanyahu under CAP's auspices. And this led to a bunch of those staffers resigning. And honestly, you can go back to this incident in 2012 and look at the battle lines that were drawn with, like, you know, Matt Duss and Glenn Greenwald and Zed Jelani and Li Fang and Ali Gharib and Eli Clifton on one side and Faz Shakir, and then on the other side, like Neera and the Israel lobby and kind of Hillary World and Politico and so on. And it sort of anticipates, like, all the major fights we've had about foreign policy since, like between this kind of neocon centrist Dem alliance and then the people who are actually trying to pull democratic foreign policy leftward. So anyway, just to wrap this up, flash forward to this week, and after apparently a few months of trying and failing to find a buyer for ThinkProgress, CAP has elected to shut ThinkProgress down and lay off about a dozen people, mostly young progressive journalists. I should note that ThinkProgress unionized recently, so CAP just shut down a unionized newsroom and is retaining the right to use the ThinkProgress name and website and publish CAP staffers on it in the future, which to my mind makes this union busting. They fired an entire unionized staff while keeping a media property running, although they're being kind of shady about what that means. I would note that Neera Tanden has not only would I note this, but one of the laid-off staffers has publicly noted this, has not said a word since Friday morning on Twitter, as much of the media world and virtually everyone who's ever worked for ThinkProgress has been complaining about this situation and mourning the site.
And this is, David, why I would quibble with your calling her a coward, because to call her a coward suggests that she has even a vague interest in human misery and suffering, that she simply has lacks the will to
yes,
address. And I'm not so sure that
Well, let's actually give one other example that I think really hits home what you're saying. So I mentioned earlier that CAP has taken a lot of money from the United Arab Emirates, which is a matter of public record. I have gotten into some difficult discussions with CAP spokespeople about when that started. There's some ambiguity as to whether it started under Neera's watch, as I contended in an article, or earlier, as they suggested but then retracted. So I hope we find out. But for now, I think it is an uncorrected assertion that it started on Neera's watch. And it went on for a number of years, and it ended in the last year after many people had complained about it. But the precipitating incident for it ending was that allegedly a CAP staffer leaked to the media his internal complaints about taking this funding. Now, there's no proof he did this, but that is what CAP alleges. His name is Ken Good. And CAP fired Ken Good. They fired him right before the holidays after, I think, 12 years of service. And then shortly thereafter, CAP announced, while patting themselves on the back, that they would no longer be taking funding from the UAE. But Ken Good remains fired. So, and actually, as I recall, this happened right before Trump's shutdown this past winter. And there were some amazing tweets in the immediate aftermath of this where Neera Tanden was like, "These people have families. They can't afford to feed their families before the holidays." And it was like, you absolutely shameless hypocrite. But, anyway. That's who Neera Tanden is.
Yeah, yes, an extraordinarily petty and vindictive person as I have experienced personally.
Oh, we've all experienced it.
Emailed my boss demanding a correction on something that did not need a correction, and my boss and her went back and forth for several rounds. So finally, I just put a little thing in there to be like, okay, Neera Tanden says we should say this.
Yeah, so that was roughly my experience. I mean, when I was doing the Duss piece, I thought it was only fair to reach out to Neera for comment, and I only heard back from her spokesperson, who at first said she was not available, but then when I said, okay, I'll say she didn't comment, sent me the blandest, most generic possible assessment of Matt Duss's performance at CAP, that he did valuable work and has done critical work since, or something like that, which I published as being from via her spokesperson. And then as soon as the article came out, the spokesperson emailed me that evening and said, factual correction, CAP did not start taking UAE money under Neera Tanden. We demand a correction. And I said, oh, well, can you let me know when they did? And I was fretting about this all night. And the next morning she emailed me and said, oh, yeah, sorry, actually, you're right. Your article was right. So she just gave me a bad night's sleep just to haze me. But I have a theory, and this is purely speculative and may very well not be right. My theory is that she accidentally told me the truth, but then realized that she had given me a scoop and that the public shouldn't know that CAP's been taking UAE money that long. I have no idea if that's true or not, but what I do know is they run a sloppy, vindictive operation there, and they hate journalists.
Yeah.
Well, and besides the terrible, vindictive, just personal failings of moral character, I'm wondering how, say, Neera Tanden and, I don't know, Rahm Emanuel's, they strike me as very similar.
Yes.
How their terribleness as human beings is actually bound up with a certain ideological understanding of maybe politics, power, and something that is kind of a disease among the body politic. Just because if I had to think of like who would be best to raise the Antichrist, I think Rahm Emanuel and Neera Tanden would be a good couple. I don't know.
Well, that's not part of my theology, but
I'm just saying I think they would do a great job. They would understand power and evil.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think in some ways, I mean, ideology is one way of putting it, but I think another way is that they're just absolutely typical creatures of the Beltway in a way that transcends partisan loyalties. And in fact, the supreme example of that is that Neera has been courting an active relationship between ThinkProgress and the American Enterprise Institute, the famously
CAP.
Sorry, between CAP, yes, not ThinkProgress, but although they're now one and the same. But between CAP and AEI, doing kind of joint foreign policy work, which apparently CAP does have money for, unlike supporting a small independent media outlet. And
but isn't that something that a neoliberal is prone to do more than a other kind of type of ideologically oriented person?
I mean, yes, but I think that they are functionally neoliberals, those two people, but I also think that term, is a kind of broad meaning. I mean, in a sense, we all are, because we all live under hegemonic neoliberalism, whether we want to or not. I think they're hacks and corporate operatives, basically. I think they're, I think if a President Hillary Clinton wanted like Medicare for all, then I think Neera would dutifully carry that out. But there is no President Clinton, and she doesn't want that. And CAP's job is to serve what the corporate Democratic class wants. So yeah.
Yeah. And this maybe gets to like a sort of secondary question here. You talk about DC, and I recently moved out of DC.
Congrats.
I live in Philly now. Thanks.
Although I should say it's my hometown, and I actually think it gets a slightly bad rap as a city, but nonetheless, congrats.
Yeah, I don't hate DC, and I think if you're not in politics there, it's actually rather pleasant in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But it is very expensive, and being a political journalist, you are just constantly forced to sort of rub shoulders with a very particular kind of person that I have really never ever met in any other part of the country, which is the just absolutely sociopathic careerist.
Oh yeah,
like the social climber who just is like sizing you up in a glance. Like how can this relationship, a potential relationship with this person, friendship or what, like serve my career goals, like how might I step on your head on my way up the greasy pole, basically.
Right. And while those people
like,
definitely exist in every major city, and certainly here in New York, and I would imagine in some contexts in Philly too, there's something
oh
about
yeah,
how that coexists with a sense of being like really earnest progressive Democrats that is really revolting when you start to see how it works.
yeah, and but I kind of just think I don't know if there's any way of like changing that or getting rid of it forever. It's like if you just in a sort of political career, like that's what a giant, powerful country attracts. It's like people who want to sort of join the ruling class or whatever, and they just sort of modulate themselves to, the incentive structure. And so one thing you would have to do if you want to, change the foreign policy, get rid of the atrocities, stop committing, war crimes and invading countries for no reason, you'd have to change that career sort of pathway, I think, or that would certainly be one part of it to make it so that, if you want to, have a good, nice career, you can't just be, like that one VP of CAP's foreign policy scholar, I forget her name, but who was praising, praising Elliot Abrams as this like, humanitarian fucking, worker, Mother Teresa-esque,
Well, she ended up doing like that drill tweet about ISIS where she was like after everyone got mad at her, she's like, you do not in fact have to hand it to him. That was really embarrassing and kind of shocking that like a prominent, theoretically progressive Democrat was like going out there saying Elliot Abrams is a very nice man, as if that matters.
Yeah. So anyways, that sort of ties in to this new think tank, the Quincy Institute,
yes,
which is a very peculiar thing, but they're trying to do, I guess because the thing about it is like before I lived in DC, I think like, what's the point of a think tank? Like these places write like white papers and shit. They're not even peer reviewed. Like, what is the point of this? And, learning is, and like trying to do analysis and so on is kind of a point. But I think, it's also about sort of playing power politics, and it's just like something you kind of can't avoid in this, fallen world. So can you tell us about the Quincy Institute and like what they're trying to do with, like to change the conversation, for lack of a better phrase?
So the Quincy Institute is a non-interventionist think tank. It is not specifically left-wing. It is
right.
It is nonpartisan, and I think they might say non-ideological. And there are various reasons for that, but one, which I don't think we can overlook, is that among its founding donors, the two biggest and most prominent, although they collectively have given them about $1 million, so not even half their starting budget, but still, the two founding donors most noted are George Soros and Charles Koch, who I think we could reasonably characterize as being left of center and right of center, to say the least. But neither of whom I would say is particularly valorized on the left. I mean, Koch obviously is this libertarian psycho, but Soros is, often seen as a neoliberal. I guess the term that some would use is globalist, which plays right into the many anti-Semitic tropes about him. But I think I would never in a million years want to be defending Charles Koch or the Koch network, and I want to make clear I think they are awful people, and I rejoiced when David Koch died, and I will when Charles does too. I think that's only fair, and I've read Dark Money. I understand all this. Still, I think it's worth noting that they fund a lot of things, and some of this is obviously trying to launder their reputation, and but one thing that they have given a lot of support to is ending the war on drugs and the war on crime, and I think the libertarian think tanks they've backed, like Reason, that have been committed to that, I think, have genuinely moved the conversation forward. And the fact that there are Republican politicians at all levels who, now support decriminalization of drugs, probably does have a lot to do with the Kochs. And similarly, they've actually been way ahead of a lot of Democratic donors and institutions in trying to wind down the forever war. Now, my friend Alex Koch, who is a reporter for a site called Sludge, and basically reports on money and politics, did a thing about the Kochs and Quincy recently, where he pointed out that the Kochs are hypocritical because they've also done so much to support just Republican politicians across the board, and Republican politicians overwhelmingly are very hawkish, pro-war, pro-Israel. And that's totally true. And I think they've also given money to places like AEI. So, yeah, I mean, the Kochs are not good people, and I don't know why one would trust them. But that said, they do have a lot of money, which an organization like this needs to operate. And they do seem to have a genuine interest, even if they undermine it in other ways, in supporting anti-war voices, including among powerful elected Republicans like Rand Paul or Mike Lee, or I would say Justin Amash, but he just left the Republican Party, but nonetheless. And I know that the Quincy founders, who are generally, although not entirely left-leaning people, are willing and eager to work with politicians in either party as long as they are committed to the goal of winding down the forever war.
Yeah, I found this interesting, and I don't think anything's non-ideological, but in the piece you wrote, there was a good point made, and I think the term was, I don't know if it was transpartisan or whatever it was. Things can be not partisan insofar as overlapping ideologies don't particularly help one party over the other. And I think like here, these leftists and these libertarians, their ideologies actually overlap in a way that helps them agree on at least this one particular non-interventionist perspective and policy issue, right? So the thing I found very interesting too was that once you reduce the spending of our Defense Department, then what you do with that money is going to cause lots of differences amongst the people here. It's kind of like, sure, we'll fight each other at that point, but until then, let's try to get there.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, you can support the Quincy Institute's work without supporting Rand Paul's reelection or whatever. But I mean, you don't have to. Yeah, I mean, I think you're paraphrasing Stephen Wertheim, one of the co-founders, who said, once we cut the Pentagon budget, we can decide whether that money would go to a giant tax cut for the rich or whether it would go to funding new social programs and Medicare for all. Right. And I'm sure all of us agree it should be the latter. But he didn't say that, although I suspect he would agree. But that's not the point of Quincy. So where I think you could run into trouble, and I tried to press him on this, is with something like left foreign policy priorities that are not specifically about ending the forever war. For instance, I've written some things, and others have too, about wanting to cut down on money laundering and tax havens, and offshore bank accounts and stuff that make it possible for the global oligarchy to operate. Now, do the Koch brothers want that? I doubt it. Is that something Quincy's going to prioritize? Probably not. But the most obvious one is climate. The Koch brothers, are what do they have, like coal and oil production under their portfolio, and and an awful
secondary oil products.
Yeah, and an awful lot of their lobbying and efforts over the years have been with the goal of a totally deregulated energy industry, which, as we know, is rapidly bringing about the apocalypse. And shouldn't that be like a number one foreign policy concern? Well, I think so. And Stephen Wertheim's answer to that is that one of many things we have to do to fight climate change is end the forever war. that in fact the U.S. military and Department of Defense are like maybe the most polluting institution in the world, and more than many countries combined. Like war and the war machine are, have a massive carbon footprint, and that can be Quincy's contribution to that. And, I find that persuasive. I mean, if you look at it in terms of Quincy's job is not to do everything, it's to do one thing, which is end the forever wars for many good reasons, then I think it's something that we can feel enthusiastic about.
And David, can you go to the point Ryan made in his preface to his question, actually, about what think tanks actually accomplish and how? Like, how is it that they are influential? So they're given a lot of money, the powerful ones at least. In addition to writing white papers, what is the actual mechanism by which they're influential in politics, would you say? And then we can try to think how that would apply to Quincy.
So I think the really important role that think tanks play is in the sort of Washington career ecosystem is as a kind of holding tank for political staffers. Because if you think about how Washington operates, I mean, it's a genuinely two-party system, and the two parties kind of pass power back and forth in the presidency and in Congress. And realistically, one party or the other is always going to be in charge. So that means, if you look at the lobbying world in K Street, like a lot of these lobbying shops start up, for just various corporate interests. There'll be like a staffer, a speechwriter, or a former congressman from each party will enter into a partnership, and they'll start a lobbying firm because each of them has a Rolodex of current politicians and staffers they can call up and get favors done for them, and they'll always bill themselves as nonpartisan. And when you hear a lot of people in Washington singing the praises of bipartisanship, what they're really talking about, I think, is the ability of these lobbying sectors of the lobbying sector to work with any administration and any Congress on their core priorities. So think tanks, insofar as they are corporate funded, and operate in basically the same geographic space in or near K Street, kind of have to be seen as serving a similar role. Now, granted, many think tanks have explicitly partisan leans or affiliations. I mean, CAP is clearly a Democratic think tank. AEI is clearly a Republican think tank. But you're going to have people who, depending on the outcome of a close presidential election, might be serving in the White House or the wider executive branch, or they might not be, in which case they still need jobs for the next 4 years. And it's not just for the sake of them having jobs. That's, maybe it makes it sound a little bit more cynical than it needs to. I mean, they're also, when they put out white papers, what they're really doing is laying out what they might try to do when they do get a chance to work in the White House or for a member of Congress. This means think tanks, for all that one can be cynical about them, are actually really, really important. Because you're basically, when your party is in power, the think tank is basically where the policies they're going to push are being workshopped. A classic example of this, actually, working across party lines, is the Heritage Foundation created the blueprint for a kind of market-oriented path to semi-universal health care, which then got tested out under a Republican governor, Mitt Romney, in Massachusetts, which in turn became the blueprint for the healthcare system we all use and love today under Obama and post-Obama. So it comes straight out of Heritage. So these policies matter, and the people making them matter, and tracking their careers can tell you a lot about how policies that affect all of us are made. And with that in mind, to your question of how does Quincy matter? I mean, they quite explicitly said, they're hoping to be a pipeline for future members of Congress or current ones, I guess, and future presidents. And
And doesn't it matter a lot that they don't take foreign money as well? So that we know that they take money from Soros and Koch, but it seems that a lot of the Blob, right? A lot of the other think tanks have a lot of foreign money, which, for the reasons you just gave, seems highly relevant.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, they certainly made a point of that. To me, like if you're, I mean, it's in particular, I think a lot of these think tanks like Brookings and stuff have been taking money from the Persian Gulf monarchies, which obviously have an enormous amount of money to spend. And, you know, when you take money from primarily Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, you know, that's obviously going to bias you toward policies, and I would say personnel above all, who are not going to offend those countries and their foreign policy priorities, which tend to be, among other things, U.S. intervention for the sake of regime change in Syria, support for Israel, obviously support for status quo energy policies, support for the incredibly brutal genocidal Saudi war in Yemen, and just generally planning for an eventual U.S. war with Iran. Those are all things that I think anyone on the left or anyone of conscience should oppose. But those are all very mainstream views across the foreign policy world. And I think Gulf, Saudi and Emirati funding of these think tanks, as well as obviously the elaborate Israel lobby, which is very much on board with all of that, is a big reason why. And it's a big reason why we got the Iraq War, too. And so, yeah, I think not taking money from those sources is a kind of gesture. I mean, you could caricature this as a kind of America First nationalism, which I think the charming neoconservative writer Jamie Kirchick has done with regard to Quincy. But you know, the absolute boy, Jamie Kirchick, one of our true faves. We stan a legend, but he you know, he wrote a very critical piece, I think, in the Washington Post about Quincy recently, which they pushed back hard against, where he kind of accused them of being American first isolationists. Bill Kristol, who obviously is in that world too, kind of made a similar point when they were announced. You know, it's not fair, and it's meant to make them sound racist or Trumpian in some way, but there is a narrow sense in which, I mean, it riffs on something that I think is true, which is that this is a kind of broadly realist group, the Quincy's, and the Quincy Institute, sorry, not the Quincy's, and they want they want to put the American national interest, as they perceive it, front and center in foreign policy, which to their mind means not whatever Saudi Arabia or Israel say it is.
And you see, David, the world needs the United States to be its policeman, because we all know the model of police helping people is the perfect picture of reality. So
right.
What we need is more policing.
Right. No, I mean, when I think highly efficient, just, and rational systems, I think police departments as they operate in the United States, for sure.
This is maybe a good point to bring up Matt Duss.
Yes.
You know, you wrote a great profile in there and in The Nation, and so he kind of illustrates one of your points there, which is like he comes from ThinkProgress, which sort of gave him his first gig, if I'm not mistaken.
It was his first full-time job in policy. Yeah, he had been freelancing for the American Prospect right before that, but yeah.
Yeah, and he had a very unusual upbringing. He didn't, he graduated college late, got a master's degree, and so on. But he's now like Bernie Sanders' foreign policy guy, and I would say, someone whose views, as I can see them, like track very, very close to my own, like a sort of, you might call it like a progressive realist perspective, and someone who's like, talking about the national interest in so far as you're like, trying to represent the, needs of the American people first and foremost, and, act humanely in a world, and above all, just don't commit any horrifying atrocities,
Right.
And so, like, I don't know, can you tell us, like, a little bit about, like, how Sanders' like foreign policy perspective and sort of staffing has been changed, because it's so different from what I remember in 2015 and 2016.
Sure. So
it seems like a new thing coming up.
Yeah. So, well, let me just say first, this is a slightly semantic correction. I don't really think of Matt Duss as a realist in the formal academic sense of the term. Not to say he's an unrealistic person. I think of him as
sure.
I think of him as basically a humanitarian liberal, but not an interventionist, not like a Samantha Power type. I think he is motivated by a sense of human rights and justice that comes from, working in a Christian. He grew up in an evangelical Christian family and did refugee work in Southeast Asia or in the Philippines when he was a kid. He became fascinated with the Muslim world as an adult, and I think that's kind of what guides him. There are people at Quincy who I do think meet the more kind of Steve Walt version of realism, like Andrew Basevich, their acting president, and Wertheim. But, I think those two worlds, and I think all the people I'm talking about would say this, have come to overlap a great deal, mostly since the Iraq War. I think the Iraq War was a kind of transformative moment when a lot of humanitarian liberal interventionist types who had been for all the Balkan wars in the 90s and stuff became big Iraq hawks. Many of them, like Peter Beinart, have come to regret that very publicly. Meanwhile, there were people with maybe similar politics otherwise who I think saw that as just a crime and a fiasco from the start. And then there were realist Republicans who, might have been the champions of the first Persian Gulf War in 1991 or of a lot of Cold War policies, who, I'm talking about people like Brett Scowcroft, who or Basevich, who were completely horrified by the Iraq War from the get-go. And so I think both of those strains have kind of evolved into something we might call progressive realism now, although no one has really nailed that down. But as far as Bernie's evolution, I actually kind of see it as going in three stages, because I think there's a kind of a prehistory when he's an activist and then the mayor of Burlington, where he's kind of pursuing his own lefty foreign policy. In terms of building bridges to the Sandinistas or to the Soviet Union during Perestroika, and speaking out against, I might be making this up, but I imagine apartheid and things like that in the 80s. And then when he actually gets to Congress and the Senate, I mean, he definitely opposed the Iraq War, but I think his focus has always been, and certainly when he became most widely known nationally in 2016, running for president the first time, very focused on inequality, poverty, the 1%, Medicare for all, free college. I mean, those are the things he came to be known for. And so in 2016, his 2016 candidacy, as much as his supporters, I think, sometimes have difficulty fully admitting this, was a protest candidacy. I mean, certainly when he started, he didn't expect to win. Hillary Clinton really was seen as inevitable. I think after he won New Hampshire handily, there was a brief moment, I sort of speculating here, but in his mind and in the minds of the people closest to him, where he thought, oh, maybe I can actually do this. And then I think once he started losing by blowout margins in states with mostly black Democratic electorates, like in the South, I think it became clear to most of us that he wasn't going to win. I know there are some Bernie diehards who insist that, he really could have done it and that it was stolen from him. And I don't think that's true, but I do think the whole thing was rigged for Hillary Clinton several years out. And no one else was supposed to be a serious challenger. And Bernie pissed off the establishment by doing it anyway. But even so, I mean, she certainly beat him by a sizable margin, which is not in any way to take away from his immense accomplishment at mainstreaming the left and bringing young people into politics that year. And he's been running ever since right after the 2016 campaign, where he did get knocked for not having foreign policy advisors, which was partly because he was running a protest campaign focused on inequality, partly because it was just kind of disorganized, and partly because Hillary World, part of their rigging the whole process was they basically called up every foreign policy expert in Washington who was remotely Democratic sympathetic and said, hey, would you like to be an advisor on our campaign? And of course, they all said yes, because they all assumed Hillary would be president, and that would give them, some access to her down the line. So then she could say, well, look, everyone in the foreign policy world has endorsed me. They must love me. I mean, which is kind of a microcosm of the entire debacle that was the Hillary 2016 campaign. Just like everyone, good and bad, just operating under the assumption that this is the future. I mean, why did Elizabeth Warren endorse Hillary Clinton? Why did she not endorse Bernie Sanders and then, eventually endorse Hillary? Because she, too, believed that Hillary would be president and wanted to have access. And that's kind of how everyone was thinking. But, why was Donald Trump taking giant... why was Donald Trump negotiating a giant real estate project with the Russian government and lying about it to the American public while he was running for president? Because he also thought about life beyond this presidential campaign. He didn't think he was going to win either. So that's kind of a universal. And why did Barack Obama do nothing really to stop Russian interference or announce it to the public? Same thing. So in terms of Bernie, it was like, okay, there's not really much of a talent pool to choose from. There was some informal network advising him as the campaign got underway. Kind of people like, I know Rob Farley is one example, Dan Nexon, were putting together these very informal kind of web email-based advisory circles and trying to brief Bernie people. But that was a very kind of ad hoc effort. But as soon as Hillary lost and we were all in a new reality, it was a month later, I think, that Bernie hired Matt Duss as his foreign policy advisor. And it should be said for his Senate office, not
right.
necessarily for a presidential campaign. I believe Matt is still working for the Senate office. And since then, Bernie has become very outspoken on foreign policy, and particularly, I think his signature issue has been ending the Saudi war in Yemen, where he's done some really novel things, heavily advised by Matt Duss.
Yeah, an actual bipartisan compromise thing. Oh, yeah. You never thought you'd see that again.
Yeah, well, the specifics of that are that the first senator who actually really stuck his neck out on Yemen in a way that was brave, if not particularly effective, was Senator Chris Murphy, the Democrat from Connecticut, who, because the Yemen campaign started late in Obama's second term, and the Obama administration signed off on what the Saudis were doing on providing mid-air refueling and targeting information for Saudi jets as they bombed the Houthis and civilian populations in Yemen, and cut off their port and starved them. And Chris Murphy saw early that this was a terrible thing, but his bill, which I think he co-sponsored with Rand Paul, and which only got, 20 or so votes in the Senate, was to stop selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. That was the approach he took. And what Bernie did, and Murphy co-sponsored once Trump took over, which changed the politics of this a lot, because now everything we do abroad is evil and it's Trump, even if we were doing it under Obama. And that's how Democrats think of it anyway. So that changed the politics a lot. But Bernie also put forward an argument, which you're going to see a lot coming from the Quincy Institute as well, a constitutionalist argument, which he's also trying to use to wind down the war on terror and the 2001-2002 maybe also 2003 authorization for the use of military force, which is basically that all these wars we're fighting in Yemen, Somalia, Niger, whatever, were never actually authorized by Congress. They all represent executive overreach. And so for good constitutional, conservative first principles reasons, we should start reasserting congressional power over the ability to make war. And Bernie's bill, which was sponsored by Ro Khanna, the California Democrat in the House, actually made it through both the House and Senate, which was not a sure thing in either case, and then was promptly vetoed by Trump. And there's not a veto-proof majority for it. But that was a huge step forward in terms of reframing the issue and showing how little appetite there is among virtually all Democrats and a sizable minority of Republicans toward continuing these wars. And really, I think if Congress looks anything like it does now, or hopefully better, and Bernie Sanders is president, or presumably Warren or some of the others, I think you could very easily pass a bill like that, and it would fundamentally change U.S. foreign policy.
I think it was actually CAP did like a big survey on like a sort of panel thing with a bunch of ordinary Americans on their foreign policy views, and like the overwhelming impression was it was just like, what are we doing? What are we doing with all this bullshit over, this wars that never end? Like, what the fuck, man? And I feel like that's a really like durable sort of, ground. Like the Blob is just sort of standing on air, it seems to me, in terms of the actual public support for all this imperialism. Nobody wants this shit, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that what has allowed it to happen, above all, is fear. And I mean, I'm not breaking any new ground here, but I think everything we've been doing, a lot of it has a long prehistory, but really this current era of endless war that we're trying to wind down, it comes directly out of 9/11 and this moment of bipartisan, overwhelming public horror that, anyone who lived through it, I think, understood on some level, like this sense of American vulnerability, and people came to their senses at different speeds, but now we've had some small terror attacks or near misses in the last few years, and it's actually been kind of like, does anyone even remember when like there was that guy who drove a truck on this like bike path in Battery Park City right near the World Trade Center like maybe 2 years ago? Maybe it was like even near the 9/11 anniversary, and it was like a one-day story, and it like killed a few people, but like it was a horrible story, obviously, but it was like really reassuring in a way that like, we aren't like geared up to just invade Iran on any pretext now. Like we're really tired. A whole generation has been killed, traumatized, and maimed by these wars, and why? And that's not like a lefty position anymore. In fact, I think I saw a Pew survey to the effect that a large majority of veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan believe those wars were not worth fighting for now. So,
yep.
So David, do you see a difference between a Bernie and a Elizabeth Warren foreign policy approach based on who's advising them, or your understanding of their views? It's interesting how you said a lot of people have been converging on the liberal left side, in recent years, but I bet you at some point there's going to be an important difference, and I'm wondering if that's something that would be found among these two candidates or not.
So I see two differences. One is and you could maybe analogize this to some other aspects of the Sanders-Warren comparison too. And I should say I like and respect Elizabeth Warren, and like many left-oriented Democrats and progressives, I would certainly be happy if she were the nominee compared to anyone else running besides Bernie Sanders. And I respect her and a lot of the people around her. But one thing is I just don't think she cares as much about foreign policy. I think Bernie, although he didn't prioritize it in 2016, has some history of caring about it, has generally had the right instincts when he has. There was a wonderful moment, I'm sure you remember, in 2016 when he both defended Palestinians on a stage with Hillary Clinton and also said he would not be proud to be friends with Henry Kissinger, who is a war criminal, unlike her. And I think the fact that he felt moved to say that, which is not like a giant vote getter, it's just a signal about who you are. And I think that said a lot about who he is and who she is. Now, Warren doesn't have any history of palling around with Kissinger either, and unlike Hillary Clinton, did not like directly play a role in backing multiple wars and attempted wars over the last 20 years. But so I wouldn't analogize them at all. But I just don't think. I think Warren's career really does center on like Wall Street, corporations, big banks, like consumer protections, and those are the things that get her up in the morning. All great things to be concerned about, but I think foreign policy's always kind of been an afterthought for her. So that's one difference, and then the other is I think if you're into kind of like reading the tea leaves specifically on Israel-Palestine, which I am, I think. I don't know that she's like actively bad on it to be in the way that a lot of Democrats, like, your Chuck Schumers are. But I think that like most Democrats, it's something she would just rather not deal with and not like alienate any constituents she agrees with on everything else by dealing with. Whereas Bernie, who I've written a lot about this, is Jewish, would be the first Jewish president, is like a product of the old Jewish labor left. Once worked on a kibbutz for a summer in the 60s, as Noam Chomsky and Tony Judd and other critics of Israel did, and I think has a sincere personal investment in opposing what Netanyahu and the right-wing Israeli government are doing, and in standing up for Palestinian rights. And I don't know that Warren has that same stake, or that any of the other candidates do. And I think, if you look at where she is on things like ending the forever war, I think she, and for that matter, many of the other Democrats running, I think Buttigieg and Beto and others are broadly moving in the right direction. I mean, they see where public opinion is. But nobody has hired someone as outspoken on this stuff as Matt Duss. I mean, Bernie, I think, like actually decided to make foreign policy part of his package and his persona after 2016, and I think you can really see that. You can see leadership in that regard.
Yeah.
Do we know who is influential for Warren? Because if she cares less, presumably that gives even more power to whoever's in charge of advising her on foreign policy. Right?
Yeah, I think, what is his name, is like Ganesh Sitaraman or something like that. I've heard generally good things about him, but I don't think he has the same connections to like activist circles as some of Bernie World. And I mean, granted, Bernie World does with me, but with lots of other reporters too, like Ben Wallace-Wells, I think, at the New Yorker, has really tried to, I mean, they've been doing a press push. They want people to write nice things about Bernie's foreign policy. Whereas Warren World, I mean, I would say most of the other candidates are not really doing that. I mean, Biden is being advised by old Blob foreign policy hands, people who've been around forever. And, most of them, I mean, foreign policy is not what most voters care about either, in either party. And so when you're running in a primary, it's generally not what you prioritize. Now, an exception might be if there's a war mentality, which I think circa 2004 there was. But for all we've been at war for years now, it's really dropped from the public radar, which is kind of disturbing in its own way.
Yeah. The ability of the state to just be able to, it's more and more automated, or you're, just these pilots who aren't even in the planes anymore. They're in like a air-conditioned shipping container in like Scottsdale, blowing people up. It's like totally costless to the It's except for money.
Well, money, and actually people who've done exactly what you just described, I think, have had PTSD over it.
Yeah, true. But
yeah,
it's not like mass conscription, or it's like your son or daughter getting out.
Yeah, it's out of sight, out of mind, and you have to wonder, like, how many Americans who read the newspaper every day could even hazard a guess on how many active war zones the U.S. has been involved in since 9/11, and in many cases involved in right now. When that serviceman died in Niger, I assume the reaction of virtually the entire American public was, "There's a country called Niger," I mean, let alone we have military operations there, but like that's post 9/11 reality, and that's what the people we're talking about, I think, are trying to change.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a pretty good place to stop. Anything else you want to mention before I let you go, David? Anything you want to plug?
I think that is the gist of it. I think people should definitely take a look at jewishcurrents.org and subscribe to the magazine. And if you have any connection to Jewishness or to the left or to debates over Israel-Palestine and the Middle East, I think you'll find that I hope you'll find that it's a breath of fresh air.
Yeah, definitely. We'll link to that and your Nation articles in the description. But yeah, thanks for coming on, David.
Yeah, thanks so much.
We'll see you.
Great. Yeah, thanks, David.
Great talking to you.
Yeah. And bye-bye, everybody.
I'm going to hit.